In today's video, we're going to see a thriller movie called The Resident, released in 2011. Dr. Juliet Devereaux is a medical doctor who lives in New York. In the initial scenes, we see her working at the hospital and having to perform an emergency heart surgery on a patient. The medical procedure is successful. Later that day, Juliet sits and cries on the bed of a hotel room. She turns off the TV and goes to sleep feeling sad. The next day, Juliet looks for an apartment to rent in the Brooklyn area. She finds an ad and decides to talk to the realtor to visit the property. After checking it out, she dislikes it and moves on to find a better opportunity. She then goes inside a building being renovated and talks to the owner, a guy named Max. Juliet figures she can't afford a place that big, but Max tells her the rent is quite cheap, although heating costs are not included. He further adds that he's renovating most of the apartments in the building, which his family acquired in the 40s, so the noise might be a problem. Juliet says she doesn't care, since she's a doctor and therefore doesn't get much sleep. Max says that the subway passes underneath the building, so there's also occasional trembling. In spite of all the issues, she loves the place. Max then hands her the keys before coming up with all the paperwork. When Juliet is moving in, she's surprised by August, Max's grandfather, who lives in one of the apartments of the building. He apologizes for scaring her and they introduce themselves to each other. The night falls and Juliet is taking a warm, relaxing bath. After her skincare routine, she hears a moan, which is soon covered up by the subway noise. A few hours later, she wakes up at night hearing strange noises. She gets out of bed and notices that the door of the apartment is wide open. She locks it and checks the living room. After not seeing anything unusual, she goes back to bed. The next scene shows the shadow of a person walking right outside her room. The next day, she gets home after her morning run and finds a welcome gift by her doorstep. August watches her as she takes it and goes inside. When she gets to work, she receives a text from Jack, her ex-boyfriend. Juliet has been ignoring him after he cheated on her and they broke up. Sydney, her friend and co-worker, says she deserves better. Sydney then convinces Juliet to go out with her that night and have some fun. When Juliet gets home, she runs into Max and thanks him for the welcome gift. However, he says he didn't get her anything. Juliet then knocks at his grandfather's door and mentions the gift, thanking him. August rapidly changes the subject and asks her if she finds it difficult to live there among strangers. He also mentions that he feels lonely. Juliet feels awkward and comes up with an excuse to leave. The next day, Juliet goes to an art exhibition with Sydney. Coincidentally, Max is also there and bumps into them. Juliet then introduces him to Sydney, who seems to like Max. Sydney invites Max to have a drink with them, but he says he was getting ready to leave. Sydney whispers she felt some chemistry between Juliet and him, defending they should date. Juliet feels unsure of the idea, since he's her landlord, but decides to ask him to walk her home. Thus, they leave and chat while walking. Max mentions that August had a stroke a few years back, and since then, hasn't been able to help with maintenance work. They stop by a bench on the way home and talk about life for some time. When they're almost home, Jack is seen watching them from a distance. At her doorstep, Juliet thanks Max for the lovely time and tries kissing him after saying goodbye. He dodges her and Juliet apologizes, saying she misread the signals. She then goes to her place feeling embarrassed. The next scene shows a hole in a wall, which opens to Juliet's apartment. Right before her shower, it can also be seen that Juliet's mirror is actually a two-way mirror. While she's taking a bath, a train causes trembling and her wine glass shatters on the bathroom floor. The next day, Juliet gets a call from Jack, saying he feels sorry and wants to see her. She hangs up and gets another call right away, this time from Max. Max says he feels bad about how he reacted and invites her to dinner. Later, at dinner, they seem to be hitting it off. Juliet says she feels comfortable at her new home and asks Max how come he's not married. He replies saying he's not very outgoing and says work takes most of his time. A few hours later, they kiss for the first time and end up doing it. The movie then goes into flashback mode, returning to the day when Juliet performed the heart surgery. It turns out that Max and August were also there that day, since the latter was getting a checkup. Max saw Juliet and became mesmerized. He went around and read her name on the surgeon's name tag. He then noticed a sheet on the hospital board put up by Juliet, stating she was looking for a place to rent. It then becomes clear that Max had planned the whole thing, from calling and luring her to his renovating building to following her to the art exhibition. The next scene shows Max holding a bunch of keys in his hands, which supposedly lead to the different ways to spy into Juliet's apartment. The movie goes back to present day and we can see that Max is getting what he wished for. However, in one particular day when the two are in bed, Juliet asks him to stop. She says Jack is still on her mind and she needs some time alone. Max gets angry and leaves. Next morning, while Max is preparing his grandpa's shot, August recalls of Max's dad, saying Max inherited his devious ways. Max then gets slapped in the face by his grandfather. Afterwards, Max follows Juliet into a coffee shop. He goes inside like it's a coincidence to run into her. They talk about the previous night and Juliet feels like it was a mistake. Max then suggests they interrupt whatever's going on between them, saying it's not really appropriate. Juliet is glad he feels that way and leaves. Later that day, while Juliet is already asleep, Max gets inside her room and caresses her body. When their lips are nearly touching, Juliet moves in bed, forcing Max to leave. She wakes up and appears to feel someone's presence. She looks around in the apartment with a knife in her hands, but doesn't see anything. Examining the walls, she touches a surface and causes its collapse. This reveals an empty wine room that she wasn't aware of. The next morning, Juliet calls him and asks him to take a look at the new room. Max says he'll fix the wall while she goes to work. Juliet thanks him, saying he's a good friend. Max then fixes the wall and brushes his teeth using Juliet's toothbrush. He gets inside her tub and touches himself while she's away. At work, Juliet gets another text from Jack, this time saying he misses her. Later that day, we see Juliet cooking dinner, while Max spies on her through a hole in the wall. Juliet's phone rings. It's Jack, saying he's almost there. When she goes to her room to get changed, Max goes into her kitchen and checks her phone to see who called her. Jack gets there with flowers, and also brings a dog. While the two chat, the dog goes around and sees Max. He barks profusely, but they both ignore him. Jack says his life without her is not the same, and the two make out. Max watches everything. They eventually move to the bedroom, while Max gets behind the two-faced mirror to continue peeking. After they make love, Jack announces he needs to go. In the meantime, Max is in the kitchen, mixing some of August's medication in her wine bottle. After Jack leaves, Juliet drinks more wine and soon passes out. While she's asleep, Max appears again and licks her fingers in a creepy way. The next morning, Juliet wakes up and notices she overslept. She feels weird and has a headache. She senses something's not right with the apartment. Sydney only suggests she gets a louder alarm clock. Juliet then decides to install a video monitoring system in the apartment. However, the tech guy explains that the cameras don't cover the kitchen nor the bathroom. In August's bedroom, Max takes a syringe and injects some meds in his throat. He agonizes and eventually dies. Max feels no remorse. Later that day, Jack and Juliet get together for dinner at a restaurant. Max is seen outside watching them. Jack says goodbye to Juliet and the couple goes separate ways. Max follows Jack and fiercely bumps into him at a staircase. Jack rolls down the stairs and gets hurt. Max simply goes home and leaves Jack there. Afterwards, Max watches Juliet having some wine. He waits for an opportunity to drug her again. Soon she falls asleep and he enters her room. Max unbuttons her shirt and caresses her face. He then pulls her to himself and Juliet surprisingly opens her eyes. Max immediately gives her a shot at her big toe, making Juliet pass out again. However, Max doesn't go any further. He starts crying because he knows that's the only way he gets to be with her. The next day, Juliet wakes up feeling under the weather, once again oversleeping. While getting dressed, she notices the lid of a syringe under her bed. She takes it with her to the hospital and doesn't realize her monitoring system has 7 new recordings. When she gets to the hospital, she takes blood and urine samples from herself to get analyzed. Jack sends a text to Juliet inviting himself to dinner. When he gets to her place, Max is lying in Juliet's bed, caressing some of Juliet's clothes. As Jack walks around the apartment, he notices one of the secret doors Max uses wide open. When he decides to check the new room, Max gets behind him and pushes him inside the room. Meanwhile, Juliet gets the results from her tests and finds that someone has been drugging her. She rushes to her apartment and tries calling Jack on the way, desperately trying to warn him not to go to her apartment. Juliet gets home but doesn't find Jack or anything suspicious. She then sees the recording notifications on her computer screen and decides to watch them. She finally finds out the truth about Max. She sees what he's done to her and starts crying in despair. Suddenly, Max knocks on her door and enters the apartment. Juliet turns off her computer and tries to hide her crying face. Max then offers Juliet some wine and raises a toast to honor their friendship. However, Juliet refuses and Max gets suspicious. Juliet proceeds saying she's been having trouble sleeping lately and feels exhausted. Juliet gets away from him and gets her phone, trying to reach Jack. Max approaches and asks Juliet why she's trying to call him. She then asks Max where Jack is, but he remains silent. He forces Juliet to sit down and tries to calm her. He sneakily gets a syringe in his back pocket and shoots it in Juliet's leg. Juliet then stabs Max in his shoulder and tries to run away from him. However, Max grabs her and the two start fighting around the apartment. While Max is escaping through a door, Juliet strikes Max with a knife again and promptly barricades it with her fridge. She tries calling the cops, but the calls don't go through. Max then reappears from behind her and tosses Juliet in her bed. She pretends to enjoy being touched by him and unexpectedly hits him in the crotch. She runs to the bathroom and starts feeling dizzy from the shot Max gave her. While she stares at herself in the mirror, Max breaks it from the other side and pulls Juliet to the secret passages of the building. Juliet now stabs him with a hair clip and runs away from him. She finds a nail gun and manages to get back to her kitchen. As Juliet is looking for him, Max surprises her and punches Juliet in the face. She falls down, stunned, and Max gives a speech saying he never planned to hurt her like that. When Max is about to end her life, Juliet grabs the nail gun and shoots him in the chest. As she's escaping through a tiny passage, Max grabs her feet, but Juliet kicks him and gets to the other side. There, she reaches a dead end in a room and sees Jack's body hanging from the wall. She breaks the window to finally create a passage to the outside. When Max gets to the room, he believes Juliet has escaped. She surprises him from behind and they start fighting again. At last, she shoots him 3 times with the nail gun, with a final headshot, and brings his sick life to an end. Thanks for watching. If you like our content, please like the video and don't forget to subscribe.